All right, so are you ready to dive deep? Today, it's culture of food in colonial Bengal.
Yes. This was exciting.
I know, right? It's a dissertation, so I know that doesn't always sound super thrilling,
Yeah.
but I think this is going to be really cool. Basically, imagine time traveling back to Bengal during British rule,
Okay.
and instead of, focusing on politics and wars, which we do a lot of, we're looking at it through food. Like, what were people eating? How did their kitchens change?
Right.
And what does that tell us about life back then?
Exactly. And what's cool about this dissertation is it goes beyond just listing facts,
Yeah.
It analyzes old cookbooks, satirical writings, even like agricultural reports from the time to show us how things were shifting culturally.
Okay, so where do we even begin? The topic is massive.
Well, the dissertation starts by reminding us that food, especially in a colonial context, is never just about what we eat.
Mhm.
It's really a window into power dynamics, cultural anxieties, and even how people saw themselves in others.
So we're not just talking about which new ingredients arrived in Bengal. It's like how they fit into what was already there, who benefited, all of that.
Exactly. Think about the Columbian Exchange, for example.
Yeah, the big swap of plants and animals between the old and new worlds after Columbus.
Exactly. Well, that meant new things arriving in Bengal: potatoes, chilies, tomatoes. But it wasn't just adding spice, it reshaped agriculture entirely.
Those potatoes weren't just potatoes.
Exactly. And then you have things like the British trying to grow Carolina rice in Bengal.
Oh, why?
They basically wanted to make India a giant rice farm to supply Europe.
Oh, so like, did that work out?
No, total flop. But that's what's so revealing. Even those failed experiments tell us how the British thought. They were obsessed with improving things, imposing their systems without truly understanding Bengal.
It's almost like they thought, ooh, shiny new rice. Everyone must want this.
Right. And that same thinking applies to how they tried to get Bengalis to eat more manioc and potatoes as replacements for rice. Which is funny because back in Europe, those were often seen as lower class foods.
So it's low class in Europe, but an improvement for Bengal. What a mixed message.
Exactly. It shows this contradiction, this wanting to exploit Bengal while also imposing their own cultural ideas.
So new ingredients, yes, but with all this baggage attached to them.
Absolutely. Now, how about we shift gears a bit to how cooking itself changed in Bengal because of colonialism?
Okay, so before British rule, cooking wasn't just a woman's thing, right?
Right.
There are texts mentioning men cooking, especially for religious stuff. So what happened?
Well, colonialism played a huge role. The British had this image of the ideal wife, happy in her kitchen, cooking for her family, a very Western concept.
So cooking became less about feeding people, more about being a good wife.
Exactly. And this mainly applied to middle-class women. Working-class women were still doing a lot of the food work, but it wasn't romanticized the same way.
Makes sense. Different realities for different folks. Now, what about this rise of Brahmin cooks?
Oh, yeah. So Brahmins, traditionally the priestly caste, weren't supposed to cook for others. But as middle-class Bengali women became more educated and took on other roles, they needed help in the kitchen.
Right.
And who better to trust with the purity of your food than a Brahmin?
So it's holding on to tradition, but within this changing life.
Exactly. And this whole tension between tradition and modernity plays out in how Bengali food itself evolved, especially with that very British word, curry.
Oh, yeah. The curry question. What, even IS Bengali food. I mean, it seems like it became this mix of British and Indian elements under British rule.
Oh, you got it. And it wasn't always a smooth blend. There were worries about authenticity, debates about what was real Bengali food versus this new hybrid cuisine.
Gotcha.
In fact, one cookbook author, Bipradas Mukhopadhyay, insisted that curry wasn't Bengali at all. He said it was a Muslim or Jewish dish the British adopted.
Wow. So even back then, curry's origins were debated. It's interesting, though, that cookbooks from that time, DO, include curry recipes, but often with unique twists, like they were trying to make it their own.
Absolutely. It shows how cultural exchange often means taking something and adapting it, making it your own. It's a two-way street.
And it wasn't just happening in India. The dissertation mentions this British woman, Jennifer Brennan, who grew up in colonial India. She hated the Indian food in Britain, said it couldn't compare to what an Indian chef made for the Queen.
Right. Like, authenticity isn't just ingredients, it's the whole context.
And the whole context was changing rapidly. Okay, so we've got new ingredients, shifting roles in the kitchen, and this hybrid cuisine. What's next?
Well, all of this wasn't just happening in homes. It spilled out into public spaces, changing how people interacted, challenging old hierarchies, and creating new platforms for cultural expression. Restaurants, cafes, even tea stalls.
Ooh, I like where this is going. Let's talk about eating out. All right, so we're talking about how food and eating in colonial Bengal moved into these public spaces.
Right, it's not just happening at home anymore. You've got restaurants, cafes, those tea stalls popping up.
It's a whole new scene emerging. But we were talking about how food was tied to purity and caste. So eating out, wouldn't that be a big shift? Sharing food made by people from different castes.
Absolutely, a huge shift. And the dissertation brings this to life,
Yeah.
using these satirical essays, fictional accounts from the time.
Oh, I love those.
Right. There's one that pokes fun at middle-class Bengali men, all eager to dine with people of different castes in these fancy restaurants. Shows it was becoming common, but some people were definitely side-eyeing it.
It's like those restaurants where these little melting pots, everyone mixing together, sometimes awkwardly, but always with something to say about it.
Exactly. And certain foods became part of this new public dining scene, think tea, relatively new to Bengal then, but it took off in those spaces.
Yeah, because it wasn't bound by the same purity rules as
Wow.
traditional Bengali food, right?
Right. So you could share it more freely across caste lines. The dissertation even suggests that tea actually helped improve intercaste relations in some cases.
Imagine that. Having tea, breaking down barriers. Who knew?
It's a great example of how food can bridge those divides. Of course, not everyone was happy about it, but for many, it represented this taste of modernity, breaking free from tradition.
You can almost picture it. People from all walks of life at the tea stall, sipping chai, chatting about the latest news, maybe even debating British rule.
Right, it captures that energy of the time, but while some were enjoying this, there was a different reality playing out too.
Oh yeah, we can't forget about the famines that hit Bengal under British rule. Policies, natural disasters, it was brutal.
Exactly. And while some were experimenting with new cuisines, others were struggling to survive, it really exposed those inequalities of the system.
And the dissertation talks about how those famines actually broke down some of those strict social norms.
Absolutely. People were so desperate for food, they had to set aside those deeply held beliefs about who they could eat with.
So like Hindus accepting food from Muslims, things that were usually taboo.
Exactly. When you're facing starvation, those rigid caste rules just couldn't hold up. It showed the limits of those hierarchies.
Wow, famine is this great equalizer. It's a powerful point.
It is, and it kind of sets the stage for another shift that the dissertation explores, this new focus on nutrition that emerged.
Okay, so we've got famine making people rethink these food taboos, and now we're talking about nutrition.
Right. As we move into the 19th century, there's this growing awareness of how diet impacts health. But in colonial Bengal, this took on a very specific kind of colonial flavor.
What do you mean by colonial flavor?
Well, colonial medical authorities often said that the Bengali body was inherently weak, deficient. It needed the right kind of nourishment to reach European standards of strength.
Like Bengalis weren't strong enough because they weren't eating like the British.
Exactly. It played into those stereotypes of Indians being weak. And the dissertation points to texts promoting a pure, hygienic diet, often based on this romanticized view of pre-colonial Bengal. It's like they were using science and nutrition to push their own cultural biases.
Our way of eating is better, so you need to eat like us.
Right. Classic colonial power move. And it wasn't just about promoting certain foods, it also led to all these worries about food adulteration, especially in the cities.
So concerns about the quality of food as these cities grew rapidly. Was that because of all the new foods and cooking styles coming in?
Partly, yes. But the dissertation argues those anxieties were also tied to this feeling of cultural unease, this fear that traditional values were fading away.
Food becomes this battleground for those bigger anxieties. It's not just what you eat, it's what it represents.
Absolutely. And a great example is the whole debate over vanaspati.
Vanaspati, what's that?
So it's this vegetable oil, kind of like margarine, that was marketed as a cheaper alternative to ghee, more affordable, easier to get. But it became controversial fast. Many people said it was inferior to ghee in taste and nutrition.
Ah, so ghee, the traditional, maybe even elite way of cooking, versus vanaspati, this cheaper option.
In a way, yes. It wasn't just about the cooking fats themselves. It was about cultural identity, economic differences, and navigating a world that was changing so fast. British pushing their ideas, Bengalis worried about purity, famine, social upheaval. A lot going on.
Wow, so much happening on those plates. Where do we go from here?
Well, despite all this, something interesting happens. By the late colonial period, Bengali cuisine becomes a source of pride. It sets Bengalis apart, both from the British and the other Indian communities.
Wait, so after all that change and uncertainty, Bengali cuisine itself becomes a symbol of identity.
Exactly. It's fascinating how something so fluid, this mix of old and new, could solidify into something people were proud of.
It's like they were taking back their food, asserting their culture, in the face of all that colonial influence.
Yeah, it's amazing how, after all that change we talked about, their cuisine became a way of saying, this is us.
Right, like a way of holding on to their identity in the face of all that British influence. So how did this play out? How did they express that pride?
Well, one way was through this whole romanticization of rural Bengal and its food traditions.
Wow, there you
It
go.
was often presented as this contrast to Calcutta, which was booming, becoming more modern, commercialized.
So it was a longing for a simpler past,
Yeah,
and that nostalgia was tied to food.
exactly. And you see this in all sorts of writing back then. Cookbooks, novels, all celebrating the unique flavors of Bengali food, those long, elaborate names they have for dishes, even the whole idea of home cooking.
It's like they were grounding themselves, finding something familiar in a world that was changing so much. Food can do that, right? Remind you of home, even if that home is more of an idea.
Definitely. And speaking of memories, the dissertation talks about this writer, Buddha Basu, who actually argued that Bengali cuisine was superior to European or Chinese food.
Oh, wow. Really? What made him say that?
Well, there's this traditional Indian idea that there are 6 basic tastes: sweet, sour, salty. Basu said that Bengali food, unlike those other cuisines, embraced all 6 of these tastes, making it more complete, more sophisticated.
He's making quite the statement there. Like, Bengali food is the most well-rounded cuisine out there.
Bold claim for sure. But it shows this growing confidence, this pride in their culinary traditions. It reminds us that food isn't just fuel. It's about identity, expression, even a form of resistance.
As we've been talking, it's striking how much food reveals about a society. From the new ingredients to those anxieties about purity to famine forcing people to break taboos, it's all there. Food is like a window into history and culture.
I agree. It's not just what's on the plate, it's what it means to the people eating it. And in colonial Bengal, those meanings were tangled up with power, identity, and how different cultures interacted.
So for anyone listening who might be new to this, what are the key takeaways from this dissertation? Like, what should they remember?
The biggest takeaway is that food in colonial Bengal was never just about eating. It became this battleground where British and Bengali ideas clashed, shaping a new sense of identity.
And we saw how those changes touched everyone, from the wealthy families to the working class, even those struggling through famine.
Right. The experience of colonialism was diverse, but food was this unifying force, something everyone had to deal with. It's a reminder that every bite has a story, and those stories are often more complex and revealing than we might think.
So next time you're having a meal, think about the history on your plate, the culture, the people whose stories have shaped what you're eating. Until next time, happy eating, deep divers.